Okay, hi everyone, and thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is Katie Quines, and I'm a graduate of the University of Oregon Spatial Data Science and Geography program, and I'm a research assistant for UO Assistant Professor Dr. Carolyn Fish. So today I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've been doing that looks at the way that American conservative news sources use maps to frame national climate change discourse. And to explain why we decided to research the relationship between maps, journalism, politics, and climate change, I want to start off with two ideas that our work relies on. And that's that maps are powerful and science is political. So the first, maps are powerful. As cartographer Dennis Woods argues in his book, The Power of Maps, maps do work in the world. And part of that is because maps tell stories about our world, stories that matter. As we all know, maps highlight social and scientific phenomena and patterns that play out in geographic space across our world. So when they're used in courtrooms, when they're shown in the legislature, or when they're featured in news articles, the power of maps can influence policy decisions and change how we think about how issues are conveyed. But the power of maps is part of maps' danger. And as cartographers like J.B. Harley, Mark Vermonier, and Ian Muhlenhaus have pointed out, maps are not objective, they're persuasive, and through the design, they often reflect the thoughts and the beliefs of the maps maker. So they portray not only stories about our world, but they highlight the parts of the story that we wish and we choose to tell. The thoughts and the beliefs of the map maker are able to be passed off as neutral. Unlike an opinion piece published in a newspaper, which is sectioned off and part of the paper captioned with the word opinion, maps don't come with a disclaimer that tells us to think critically about the author's views. Maps appear neutral. We're taught to trust maps, to regard them as some sort of an unwavering scientific process. So in other words, maps can be easily used to spread disinformation that is crucial to scientific opinion and also contrary to scientific opinion and evidence, but is able to be passed off by the map maker as legitimate. And so to illustrate an example of how maps can be used for bunk science, I want to draw your attention to research that is done by Brendan McNeil and Karen Kokasi. Their research in this article, Maps on Acid, was about how maps define the US government's response to the acid rain crisis of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And what McNeil and Kokasi found is that the coal industry made were basically purposefully misinformed maps that were supposed to stall progress on addressing the acid rain crisis. So environmentalists and scientists had collected a large body of data that proved that acid rain was impacting large portions of the US. And to play down the issue, the coal industry stole that data and twisted it to make maps that would say the exact opposite, that there was no issue. So the industry's maps look just like the scientists. They use similar data sources, very similar data to ink ratios, and they use similar colors. So these maps appeared scientific and credible to most audiences, and then they became a centerpiece of our legislative debate. And McNeil and Kokasi found that these maps were actually so convincing that they helped halt federal response to acid rain for almost 20 years. So that brings us to our second assumption. Science is political. Maps that are arguably made or used irresponsibly can impact public policy on scientific issues. And just like acid rain, the climate change debate is vulnerable to maps that spread disinformation. Because climate change is inherently spatial, research by Dr. Carolyn Fish finds that maps are one of the primary ways that we communicate issues about climate change. So whatever stories those maps tell are the stories that get to frame how we think about climate change's reality, its seriousness, and what we need to do about it. But when it comes to climate change, even though scientists want to communicate it's an urgent issue, American views, as we know, are pretty polarized. So take a look at this study from 2019 that was conducted by the Pew Research Center. And among survey respondents who identified as Democrat or leaning Democrat, we can see that 90% of respondents believed that the federal government, the US, was doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. Compare that number to just 65% of Republicans or those who lean Republican. And if you look at those who identify as conservative, that number jumps to 24%. So science is political and maps are powerful. So it's important to identify how maps are being used to further debate about climate change. And so these are our research questions here. So because conservative media has become an increasingly important voice in international politics, we decided to conduct a study of how the right uses maps in the media to talk about climate change. And so in spring of 2020, we set out to answer these two questions. The first is how does the right use or produce maps which align with their messages or spread disinformation about maps? And the second is what patterns of use does the right follow in media about climate change? So our study was done using content analysis. And to find our study set of maps, we searched through 18 different right-leaning publications, which you see here. The dates of the articles range from 2012 to 2020, depending on what was available on the websites of the publications. And you'll see here that the political views of the publications range. So they're from classic conservative, like the National Review, to what we call the alt-right, as we can see with InfoWars in this list, which is an online source started by a conspiracy theorist named Alex Jones. So to be included in the analysis, there needed to be at least one map in the article. The map needed to reference climate change directly or a secondary effect of climate change, such as rising sea levels due to glacial melt. And that had to be done in the map title or the legend, the notes, or the article itself needed to mention climate change or something related. We use a series of search terms, some of those that you see here, with keywords related to climate change or its effects, things like global warming, sea ice, carbon dioxide, map, scam, hoax. And if the website had an archive section that was tagged things like environment or energy, we searched for the articles that were stored in that tag as well. And so after searching through the articles, we ended up with a really small data set. We actually only had 29 maps that were included in the article or in the study. And that was over thousands of articles that we looked through that had been published from basically the beginning of President Obama's second term all the way through the end of the Trump administration, the beginning of the Biden administration. So the conservative media had a very sparse use of maps that seemed to differ from mainstream, broadly left-leaning media's use of maps. Using the same search criteria, Dr. Fish's previous research had found 240 maps over 33 mainstream media sources. So even before analyzing the articles, the maps and the maps' relationship to the right's climate change arguments, we were struck by the overwhelming cartographic silence of the right. So we went into our content analysis looking to answer a third question that's listed here, and that's why is the right not really making or using maps? So when we look at the articles, we notice that those containing maps have a few things that are in common. The first here is that the maps largely did not discuss potential causes of climate change. The articles focus more on secondary or third order effects on climate change. They discussed a broad range of topics. That includes things like hurricanes, wildfires, water resources, and rising seas, just to name a few. But the second thing that the articles had in common was their overarching argument. As we kind of expected going into the study, the vast majority of the maps the articles were used to deny the severity of climate change and cast doubt on the conclusions of climate scientists. The third thing the articles had in common was that they were largely opinion-based, but the articles weren't being tagged as opinion pieces. Contrary to the practices of most mainstream media sources, which label the opinion editorials, the climate denial articles in our study were passed off as fact-based, breaking news stories. But the content of the articles was clearly opinion-based, and we know that because the articles contained several key phrases, such as labeling climate change a conspiracy, calling it quote-unquote so-called fake news, or calling climate scientists or advocates closet communists or fear-mongering. So if we look at the maps themselves, we found that the maps were not made by journalists or cartographers that were working with the conservative news organizations. There was no original map made by any of the conservative publications that we had in our study set. As you see here, most of the sources, the maps that came from, the maps that were in the article came from were government agencies like NOAA, NASA, and FEMA, or they were from other publications like NBC News, ABC News, and New York Times, or the Weather Channel. And interestingly enough, the maps were usually originally published by their authors to advance our understanding of climate change. But they've been lifted so that they could argue against climate change's existence by the right-leaning media. And in some cases, the maps had actually been cropped so that the original text, their legends, or the other context had been removed to make it easier for the news source to use the map for the opposite purpose of which it had been originally intended. So perhaps most important to our research, finding on how the maps were used to spread climate change disinformation. And in our study maps, we sum up the conservative media's use of maps in a few ways. The first is here, and that's using maps to highlight singular examples that refute climate science. So we see here with this map here, this article's author, Sean Davis, is trying to use this map of weather we see in the right corner of a cold snap in DC to try to refute the idea that the Earth's temperature is rising. The second that we had, and hopefully my presentation will let me show it, perfect, is that they used obscure maps unrelated to the climate or even weather to bolster anti-climate change rhetoric. So what we see here is an American Thinker article. It's one of the more further right-leaning publications we looked at. And they're talking about sea rise. So they're disputing the idea that the seas are rising, and they ask where are America's drowned cities. In order to claim that Manhattan is actually gaining coastline over time, they took this map by Gizmodo out of context, and they said that this is showing that Manhattan is gaining land as the climate does change, so climate change isn't real. This map is actually just a historic map about landfills and Manhattan's expanding boundaries due to different structural changes that were in the city. It's completely unrelated, but it was misused by the map to suit the argument, or they misused the map to suit their argument. And the third was using locator maps as graphics to add visual interest to the article. We saw this a couple times actually, which is interesting. And so you'll see this example here on the right, that's a satellite image of Nantucket. And it was used by this Breitbart article to try to prove that President Obama's vacation home was going to be underwater, and therefore it was going to be underwater because it's an island and the seas are rising, then the Obamas wouldn't have bought it, meaning that climate change is somehow a hoax. So it's really just being used as an image to bolster that argument here. So what we learned from the study is that the rights mapping strategy is partially defined by being kind of disorganized and taking into account how we could only locate 29 maps out of thousands of the rights articles about climate change. We also argue that the conservative media's climate mapping strategy is defined by its silence. And so we found that puzzling for a few reasons. And the first is that the overwhelming lack of maps is a departure from older right anti-environmentalist arguments. There we go. We also found that data journalism is increasing in popularity, but the right is choosing to not use the maps, even though it would probably bring in more clicks on their articles. And third is that map making is faster and easier than ever with widely available tools like ArcGIS Online and free open source software and tutorials. So we thought it was odd that they wouldn't take advantage of the fact that they could twist up a map that would mess around with climate science to prove their arguments in just a few hours. So why isn't the right making maps? Well, the themes of the articles that do contain maps and the types of arguments that the very few featured maps support seem to point to the idea that the right's argumentative strategy is now moving from framing kind of the climate change debate as a war of data, like we saw in the acid rain crisis, but it's largely just a facet of the culture war. So we see a conservative shift in climate change discourse has moved from the realm of disagreement about science to the realm of ideology even further than it was. And we argue this is because an increasing number of Americans, conservatives included and Republicans included, believe that climate change is real. And so they pivoted to a strategy that frames climate change as an issue of ideology because the data doesn't support their arguments and it's harder to be twisted. And so we see this happening through the use of logical fallacies, largely that hinge on conservative values discussed of what they call climate change celebrities who we see featured often. On the left, we have Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a Democratic political figure that was featured prominently in the articles. In the middle is Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, and on the right is Leonardo DiCaprio. All these climate change celebrities were mentioned frequently in the articles that did have maps and the articles that didn't have maps. And we think that what we see here is that the Republicans have falsely equivocated certain events as illustrations of why climate change is not happening. And then they've also are tearing down what we see as the faces of the culture war. It doesn't make as much sense now to fake data because words are easier to serve to an echo chamber. So the right has quietly stopped mapping climate change in favor of ad hominem attacks. So I want to end on an example that hopefully illustrates how conservative media has shifted its rhetoric on climate change from one of data to one that hinges on the culture war. So this is actually an example from one of the articles that did have maps. And so on October 28th of 2019, the publication Red State published this article by Brandon Morse. And this is in response to a tweet that was made by Representative OcasioCortez, where she reacted to a picture of California wildfires, basically. And this was the tweet. And she said, "This is what climate change looks like. The GOP like to mock scientific warnings about climate change as exaggeration, but just look around, it's already starting. And we have 10 years to cut carbon emissions in half. If we don't, seems like this can get much worse. Hashtag Green New Deal." And so to deny Ocasio-Cortez's assertion that the California wildfires are basically being made worse by the impacts of climate change, Morse embeds a screenshot of an interactive map in the article, and that's also why it has horrible resolution. And that charts the historical locations of wildfires. It's actually been removed from the article now, probably because it's not theirs. And it was a map that was made with USGS data by cartographers Emily Zentner and Chris Hagen on behalf of the California Public Radio. If you look at it, it doesn't make any persuasive claim relating to climate change at all. And it's a historical map. But Morse frames the map in some language that kind of tells us what he's using it for. And he says, this picture shows an accumulated map of wildfires that date back to 1878 all the way to 1950. The idea that humans are causing wildfires due to their effect on the planet is incredibly shaky. And as we could see in the screenshot of the map here, that the data date is actually between 1950 and 2018. And it's showing the vast majority of fires are occurring in the latter half of that time frame. So no, the picture does not show wildfires that dated between 1878 and 1950. They show pre-1950 through 2018. And the map actually implies that fire perimeters are increasing over time. And they do correlate with increased human activity after World War II. So Morse is using the map to argue the fires have been as severe as they are now to challenge Representative Ocasio-Cortez, even though the map says the exact opposite. And that's the rhetorical shift. Instead of letting a different set of data or even manipulated data speak for itself to refute AOC's claims, Morse is taking a map from other cartographers. He's prying it of its context, and then he's making a claim about climate change that's the opposite of what the map actually shows. And that reveals to us it's not about the data and it's not about the map. It's about having some sort of visual that we're implicitly trained to sort of trust like we do with maps. And so Morse is hoping that the audience will overlook what it actually says, but he gets the credibility of having the graphic in the article. And he juxtaposes himself with AOC. And he's trying to get himself to look more credible by using that visual so that he can tear her down because his audience likely thinks of her as a celebrity of the environmental left and therefore as a stand-in for climate change. So he's using the map to make a personal attack instead of refuting the argument that climate change worsens fire disasters. So AOC is a symbol of the left's culture, and to tear her down is as good as responding to the science itself, maybe even better. And so the map serves a very marginal but important purpose in boosting his credibility against an enemy figure and by providing a visual which actually, when critically analyzed, refutes his point. So at the end of the day, it's not a war of maps and their data. It's the right forcing war of ideology and a conceptual war that you can't really map. And as cartographers who use our maps to combat anti-environment arguments, that makes our job in responding just a little bit harder. Thank you.